There was a point where Marty Scurll looked almost guaranteed to become one of the biggest British wrestlers in the world. He was in Bullet Club, he was travelling with the elite, he was wrestling at Wrestle Kingdom. He had become one of Ring of Honor's biggest stars. His entrance alone could get thousands of people screaming. And when Cody Rhodes, Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks and Hangman Page helped create AEW, almost everybody assumed there was one more member of that group who would eventually walk through the door. Marty Scurll. Except he never did, and within a matter of months, a career that had taken approximately 15 years to build virtually disappeared from mainstream professional wrestling. But before all of that, Marty Scurll was simply another young wrestler learning his trade on the British independent circuit, and this is where I actually have some personal history. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the wrestling comedian. Before we get into it, drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel. This is the story of Marty Scurll, the British wrestler who stood on the brink of superstardom before everything fell apart. Long before the umbrella, long before the Plague Doctor mask, long before anybody called him the villain, Marty Scurll came through the same wrestling school that I did, dropkicks. Marty began training at Frank Reimer's Dropkicks Wrestling Academy and later worked under John Ritchie. His early career was about as traditionally British independent as you can imagine. Small venues, local promotions, learning how to work different audiences and taking whatever opportunities came his way. His recorded professional career stretches back to 2005, and this is important to understanding Marty, because people who discovered him during the villain years could be forgiven for thinking that character appeared fully formed. It didn't. Marty spent years figuring himself out. He teamed with Paul Robinson as the Party Boys, sometimes billed as the Midnight Ravers, and eventually formed the leaders of the New School Tag Team with Zack Sabre Jr. And it was that team that became a significant part of the late 2000s British independent scene. There was already an incredible amount of talent there, but he wasn't yet Marty Scurll, international wrestling superstar. And then there is the part of Marty's career I remember personally. Marty started working regularly for Brian Dixon's All-Star Wrestling. His recorded All-Star debut came in Gravesend in June 2007, and he subsequently worked extensively for the promotion, including matches at places like Croydon's Fairfield Halls, and this was the world I eventually entered too. Town halls, theatres, holiday camps, learning how to entertain audiences who weren't necessarily there because they'd study your matches on the internet. And my first ever match at Butlins for All-Star Wrestling was actually teaming with Marty Scurll. I'd already known who Marty was because we'd come through Dropkicks, be it 5 years apart. So years before I watched him walk into packed arenas with an umbrella and thousands of fans shouting along with him, I knew him as one of the guys who'd already been out there doing the British circuit. And those holiday camp shows mattered because wrestling at Butlins teaches you something completely different. You've got children, parents, people who've never seen wrestling before, people who wandered in because it was a part of their holiday's entertainment. You've got to make them care. That education became part of Marty's foundation. But there was a problem. For quite a long time, nobody seemed entirely sure what Marty Scurll actually was. Technically, very good. Charismatic, absolutely. But there are hundreds of technically good, charismatic wrestlers. The character that many fans remember from those early years was Party Marty. Clean-cut, cocky, fun-loving, a bit of a lad. And there was nothing necessarily wrong with it. But compare Party Marty to what eventually came, and it's like looking at two different wrestlers. Progress Wrestling is probably the clearest example of that revolution, because Marty was there from the very beginning. On Progress Chapter 1 in 2012, he competed in the tournament to determine the promotion's inaugural champion. He defeated Zack Sabre Jr. before ultimately falling short in the final. He repeatedly came close to major breakthroughs without quite becoming the man. For years, Marty Scurll was almost there, and that becomes important later because eventually almost wasn't good enough anymore. Then came probably the biggest mainstream opportunity of Marty's career to that point, TNA British Boot Camp. In 2013, Challenge TV aired a reality programme following 4 British wrestlers competing for a TNA contract. The contestants were Marty Scurll, Rockstar Spud and Hannah and Holly, the Blossom Twins. This was a genuinely big deal. TNA was hugely popular in Britain at the time, and the programme gave British wrestlers exposure to an audience massively larger than anything most UK independents could offer. It featured figures including Hulk Hogan, Dixie Carter, Al Snow, Doug Williams, and British legend Rollerball Rocco. If you watched the series at the time, Marty looked exactly the sort of wrestler TNA might want. Young, good-looking, athletic, experienced enough to work, and television-friendly. But he didn't win. Rockstar Spud did. Marty nevertheless appeared for TNA afterwards, including an Impact match where he teamed with the Blossom Twins against Gail Kim, Tara, and Jessie Goddard. And once again, Marty Scurll had got incredibly close, but he hadn't quite broken through. That could have been the end of the story. Instead, it might actually have created the wrestler who became famous. By 2015, British wrestling was exploding. Progress, Red Pro, ICW. The Scene was producing Will Ospreay, Zack Sabre Jr., Jimmy Havoc, Mark Haskins, and countless others, and Marty Scurll needed something. Not another move, not another championship, but a character. Then, Party Marty disappeared. In his place appeared something darker. The hair changed, the beard appeared, and the umbrella appeared. Eventually came the fur coat, the plague doctor imagery, the finger-breaking spot, the chicken wing, and suddenly Marty Scurll wasn't trying to look like everybody else anymore. He was the villain. The character grew out of Marty's increasingly vicious presentation in Progress Wrestling. After years of repeatedly falling short, his heel transformation accelerated in 2015 and ultimately led to him defeating Will Ospreay for the Progress Championship at Chapter 25. He went on to hold the championship twice, and this is where everything clicked because the villain didn't feel like somebody doing a wrestling gimmick. It was instantly identifiable. You saw the umbrella, you knew who it was. You heard the music, you knew who it was. You saw somebody reaching for their opponent's fingers, you knew exactly what was coming. That is wrestling branding at its best. And Marty became one of the faces of that incredible mid-2010s British wrestling boom. His rivalries crossed over with an extraordinary generation. Will Ospreay, Zack Sabre Jr., Mark Haskins, Jimmy Havoc, Tommy N, Chris Hero, AJ Styles, Drew Galloway. Marty wasn't simply wrestling British wrestlers anymore. The world's best wrestlers were coming to Britain, and Marty belonged in the ring with them. Before the villain character had even fully conquered America, his British resume included bouts involving AJ Styles, Ospreay, Sabre, and many of the names who would subsequently populate WWE, AEW, and New Japan. Then, in September 2016, Marty went to California, and everything changed again. PWG's Battle of Los Angeles had become almost a scouting showcase for the best independent wrestlers on Earth. Look at the people who came through Bola during that period, and you were basically looking at the who's who of WWE, AEW, and New Japan's future. In 2016, Marty Scurll won it. 24 wrestlers competed over 3 nights in Reseda. Marty Scurll reached the final against Trevor Lee and, of course, Will Ospreay. Marty won the tournament by submitting Trevor Lee with the crossface chicken wing. That victory felt symbolic. Zack Sabre Jr. had won Bola the year before. Ospreay had won New Japan's Best of the Super Juniors, and now Marty Scurll had his major American independent breakthrough moment. Britain wasn't simply producing good wrestlers anymore. British wrestlers were taking over. Ring of Honor signed Marty Scurll in 2016, and he didn't exactly ease himself into the company. On the final night of his debut UK tour, Marty defeated Will Ospreay to become Ring of Honor Television Champion. Think about that. He'd effectively walked through the door and immediately become champion. At Final Battle, he then retained against Ospreay and Dragon Lee in a match that further established him with the American audience. The villain was no longer a British independent character. It had travelled, and then came the move that turned Marty from successful independent wrestler into something approaching a genuine global wrestling star. May 2017, Ring of Honor's War of the Worlds event. Adam Cole was leaving Bullet Club, and his replacement was revealed. Marty Scurll. Just consider where Bullet Club was culturally at this point. Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, Cody, Hangman Page, Being the Elite, Bullet Club shirts everywhere. They weren't merely a wrestling faction. For a period of time, they were probably the hottest thing in wrestling outside WWE, and Marty fit perfectly. The umbrella, the mannerisms, the comedy, the villainous character. He immediately looked as though he'd always belonged there, and suddenly Marty wasn't adjacent to the biggest independent stars in wrestling. He was one of them. Bullet Club opened the door to New Japan Pro Wrestling, and Marty didn't simply make appearances. He succeeded. He entered the best of the Super Juniors. He wrestled some of the greatest junior heavyweights on the planet. And at Power Struggle in November 2017, Marty Scurll defeated his longtime rival Will Ospreay to become IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion. Again, look at the names around him. Ospreay, Hiromu Takahashi, Kushida, Jushin Thunder Liger, and Marty belonged. Official New Japan material later described him as a two-time IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion. He wrestled on Wrestle Kingdom. He became a regular fixture of New Japan. At this point, the idea of Marty Scurll eventually appearing in WWE didn't sound ambitious. It sounded inevitable. Except WWE was suddenly no longer the only destination. This is the part that makes the story fascinating. Marty became closely associated with the Elite. The Young Bucks, Kenny Omega, Cody Rhodes, Hangman Page. Being the Elite meant fans weren't simply watching their matches. They were following their lives, their jokes, their friendships, their travelling, their characters outside the ring, and Marty was part of that universe. So when Cody and the Young Bucks organised All In 2018, Marty was there. He wrestled Okada. Think about that sentence. A kid from Dropkicks who'd wrestled British holiday camps was now wrestling arguably the greatest wrestler on earth in front of more than 10,000 people at one of the most historically important independent wrestling shows of a generation. And then AEW happened. When All Elite Wrestling was launched in 2019, Cody, Kenny, the Young Bucks and Hangman Page all became central figures. Marty didn't. But initially, that wasn't particularly suspicious. He was still contracted elsewhere, so fans waited. Being the Elite even played with the expectation that eventually the villain would arrive. Then, Marty's Ring of Honor deal approached its end, and everybody thought they knew what was coming. AEW. His friends were there, the money was there, the television platform was there. Marty seemed tailor-made for it. Instead, he shocked everybody. January 2020, Marty Scurll re-signed with Ring of Honor, and this wasn't simply another wrestler contract. Reports at the time described it as a significant multi-year agreement, and Marty was given a major creative role as lead booker, whilst retaining freedom to work with promotions including New Japan and the NWA. The Young Bucks later confirmed they'd realised Marty was probably staying with Ring of Honor and publicly wished him well. They said he wanted an opportunity to be more than simply a wrestler, and in hindsight, this might be one of the greatest sliding door moments in modern professional wrestling. Because if Marty had signed with AEW at the end of 2019, who knows? Would he have wrestled Cody, Kenny, Hangman? Would Villain Enterprises have appeared there? Could Marty Scurll have eventually become AEW World Champion? We'll never know, because within approximately 6 months, the wrestling world changed completely. June 2020, the speaking out movement swept through professional wrestling, particularly the British scene. Numerous people came forward publicly with allegations about wrestlers and figures within the industry. Marty Scurll was accused by a woman of sexual misconduct relating to an encounter in 2015 when she was 16 and intoxicated. Scurll responded publicly saying that he believed the encounter had been consensual, while also acknowledging the woman's account and saying that making a wrestling fan feel unsafe was unacceptable. Now look, I'm deliberately not going to turn this video into an investigation of the allegations. There are accounts available elsewhere if you want to read them, but you cannot tell the story of Marty Scurll's career without acknowledging it. Because professionally, everything changed immediately. Ring of Honor announced an investigation. Marty Scurll stopped appearing at its television tapings, and by January 2021, Ring of Honor announced that the two sides had mutually agreed to part ways, and just like that, the trajectory vanished. This is what I find so extraordinary about the story. A few years earlier, Marty Scurll was wrestling Okada. He was in Bullet Club. He was IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion. He was one of Ring of Honor's biggest stars. He was traveling with the people who founded AEW. Then suddenly, he wasn't on any major wrestling television. Not WWE, not AEW, not New Japan, not Ring of Honor. The villain effectively disappeared from mainstream wrestling. He eventually returned to wrestling in 2021, initially appearing in Puerto Rico, and has subsequently worked scattered independent bookings internationally. He appeared in Poland in 2022 and returned to Japan for smaller scale appearances in 2025. Match records also show him continuing to work independent dates into 2026. He hasn't stopped wrestling, but it is an entirely different career. And perhaps the clearest indication of how complicated Marty's position remains came years later. In early 2026, a photograph of Marty with Hangman Adam Page appeared online and generated significant criticism. Page subsequently explained that he had privately remained in contact with Marty, but emphasised that the friendship shouldn't be interpreted as an endorsement or an attempted rehabilitation of Marty's wrestling career. Page also described the actions underlying the allegation in extremely critical terms and acknowledged that the professional consequences Marty suffered were warranted. That tells you something. Even 6 years later, simply being photographed with Marty Scurll was enough to create controversy for one of AEW's biggest stars. That shows just how far removed Marty is from the wrestling mainstream he once seemed destined to dominate. And this is where I think the story becomes more complicated than he became famous, something happened, he disappeared. Because if you watch British wrestling between roughly 2015 and 2020, you cannot pretend Marty Scurll wasn't enormously important. The villain was massive, the umbrella became merchandise, the finger-breaking spot was instantly recognisable, the chicken wing became synonymous with him, crowds shouted along with him. He successfully transported a character created in British independent wrestling into America and Japan, and he did something many wrestlers struggle with for their entire career. He made himself unmistakable. Put 20 wrestlers in a silhouette, give one an umbrella, and you know exactly who it is. That is extraordinary character work. And that's probably why I find Marty's story stranger than I would if I only ever watched him on television. Because I've seen the beginning, I remember drop kicks, I remember what that was like for me and what it would have been like for Marty. I remember All Star, I remember my first Butlins match and standing there teaming with Marty Scurll. At that point, none of us knew where everybody's careers were going. And then I watched somebody from that same wrestling world go from British town halls and holiday camps to Progress to PWG to Ring of Honor, to Bullet Club, to New Japan, to Wrestle Kingdom, to being associated with the people who were about to create AEW. It was an unbelievable rise, which makes what happened next equally unbelievable, because Marty Scurll wasn't somebody whose character faded gradually. He was arguably at his most powerful professionally when everything collapsed. He'd just signed a major Ring of Honor deal. He'd been given creative responsibility. He could work New Japan. He was appearing for the NWA. His best friends had created AEW. He had options almost everywhere, and within months, all of those doors were gone. Professional wrestling is filled with stories about what might have been, injuries, bad booking, wrong place, wrong time. But Marty's story is different because we saw him get there. Not quite WWE, not quite AEW, but close enough that you could almost see the next chapter being written. The villain had gone from dropkicks to Butlins to British Boot Camp to Progress to PWG to Ring of Honor to Bullet Club to becoming an IWGP champion in New Japan. And then the story stopped. Today, Marty Scurll still wrestles, but he's doing so far away from the position he occupied when thousands of fans were chanting his name and his friends were building one of the biggest wrestling promotions in the world. Whether that ever changes remains to be seen, but one thing is undeniable. For a brief period, Marty Scurll was one of the hottest British wrestlers on the planet, and he came extraordinarily close to becoming something even bigger. So now, it's over to you. What do you remember about Marty Scurll and the villain era? Did you ever see him during the British wrestling boom? Did you ever think he was destined for WWE or AEW? And where do you think his career would have gone if things had played out differently? And if you want more wrestling stories, opinions, and laughs, you know what to do. And remember, I'll see you on the next one.